Today on The Nation Speaks, the Democrats' sweeping election reform bill ignites a battle in the Senate. So, what's in it? An America Q&A asks what Americans can actually agree on these days. The family of Ashli Babbitt, who was shot and killed by police in the Capitol, prepares to sue. We speak today to their lawyer. And is the new White House Gender Policy Council sexist? Some people think so. Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. It's nearly 800 pages and provoking a major partisan battle. This sweeping Democrat election reform bill, known as H.R.1 or the For the People Act, has already passed in the House and is on its way to the Senate. Republican senators have vowed to do everything possible to stop it. If passed, H.R.1 would regulate at the federal level virtually every aspect of how elections are conducted and financed. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says the bill is about transparency and empowering the people. She said, "We combat big, dark, special interest money in politics and amplify the voice of the American people." That's what she said about the bill. But Republican Senator Mike Lee from Utah, he clearly sees it differently. He said, "Everything about this bill is rotten to the core. This is a bill as if written in hell by the devil himself." So, what's in this contentious bill? Our first two guests take us through it and explain what has Republicans so spooked. So we're joined now by VonSpakovsky. You're a senior fellow and manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative at the Heritage Foundation. You're also a former federal election commissioner, among your other credentials. We'll talk about that later because that's also in this bill. But what I'd like to start with is talking about the provisions for election reform. I mentioned in my intro that at the state level, they're passing bills, related to election reform, and it's pretty much the polar opposite to what's in this one, almost, provision by provision.
Right.
Can you share some of the highlights of that, of what's in this bill?
Sure. The problem with this bill is it's basically a federal takeover of the administration of elections, which have been run by our states since our founding. And in essence, the federal bill voids all of the safety protocols and security measures that states have put in place to protect the integrity of the election process. As an example of that, many states have passed voter ID laws so that someone has to authenticate their identity when they show up to vote. This law would eviscerate state voter ID laws. They basically would not be able to enforce them. Another example of this is absentee ballots. Ballots sent through the mail are particularly vulnerable to fraud or coercion and pressure put on voters in their homes. This federal bill would make it, it would prohibit, make it impossible for states to enforce a witness signature requirement on the absentee ballots. In other words, some states want a witness to sign so they can authenticate it. It was actually the voter who filled out and completed the absentee ballot. You would no longer be able to enforce that. Second, the bill would override any state laws that prevent third-party strangers from picking up and delivering absentee ballots. Again, that's a very unwise policy because what the federal law is saying is that states have to allow everyone from candidates and campaign staffers to party activists and political operatives to be able to go to people's homes and pick up their absentee ballots, which means you're putting ballots in the hands of those who have a stake in the outcome of the election. Many states prohibit that. They would no longer be able to prohibit it. So it's many provisions like that that, as I said, would actually hurt the security and integrity of the election process.
Yeah, and looking at it, it just sort of seems to every loophole or gap that was exposed, in the chaos and the aftermath of the November election, it seems to codify.
That's exactly right. It takes all the problems we saw in last year's election and now cements them into federal law and actually makes things worse. And you can contrast this with, for example, in Georgia, the state legislature has just passed a bill in its House that would extend their voter ID law, which only applies to in-person voting, to absentee balloting. That law, if it passes in Georgia, would basically be overridden by this federal law, which would say, sorry, but you can't require an ID for absentee balloting. Let me tell you how bad this is. This bill also requires, the federal law, states to put in same-day voter registration. In other words, states would have to allow a person to walk into a polling place on election day, register, and immediately vote. When you combine that with the fact that states can't ask for an ID, it means that I could walk into any polling place. So could you, anywhere in the country, register under false name, immediately vote, walk out of the polling place, and then do it again. And there's no way election officials could stop you from doing that.
And aren't there also provisions in there, it seems to be preventing cleaning the voting rolls, which was a major issue?
Yeah, there are major restrictions on what states can do to maintain the accuracy of their voter rolls, to, for example, find people who have moved out of the state. Remember, in the U.S., voter registration lists are maintained by the states. So it often can be difficult for a state to know that someone, for example, who lived in Georgia has now moved to a neighboring state like Alabama and is now registered to vote there. If they remain registered in both states, they could illegally vote twice in an election. This federal bill makes it extremely difficult for states to do things like compare their state voter registration lists. It even restricts the ability of states to use the U.S. Postal Service's national change of address system to find people who have moved. The Postal Service has a system where you can file with them and give them your new address, and they will forward your mail to your new residential address. States have always used this to try to find people who have moved, and now they are restricted in their ability to use that.
It's a bit mystifying, all of these provisions that are in there. What is the overt justification for these provisions?
Well, they keep saying, the sponsors of this bill keep saying that, oh, there's all this voter suppression going on, that these laws, like voter ID, are just intended to keep people out of the polls. That is just a ridiculous claim. There's no voter suppression going on. In fact, we have seen turnout in U.S. elections consistently go up in the last few elections that we've had, while states have been doing things like putting in voter ID laws. Frankly, I really can't see any reason for these provisions other than to make it easy to cheat and easy to manipulate election results.
Wow. So what do you think the states' reaction are going to be? I mean, as you said at the outset, this is a power grab. It's, you know, from the state perspective, right, the federal government and what's normally the state's responsibilities of running elections. Isn't that counter to what it says in the Constitution?
Yeah, it is. And, you know, more than a dozen secretaries of state have protested to Congress through a letter about this bill. I think almost 24 state attorney generals have similarly protested this federal bill and saying that it should not be passed and it violates their rights to run their elections. So there's a great deal of opposition in the rest of the country. It's true that Democrats passed this in the House on a party line vote. Only one Democrat voted against it. But in the rest of the country, there is a great deal of opposition to this bill.
Is there opposition to this bill even in Democrat-controlled states? Because this is a state federal government issue as well.
Well, I would hope there would be, because I think what Democrats need to be looking at, particularly Democratic state officials, is, look, there might be some parts of this bill they like, but they should resent the idea that the bureaucrats in Washington will be telling them how to run their elections and basically taking away from their voters in their states the ability to decide what the rules would be for running their elections. And that alone is a good reason for them to oppose this bill.
So let me move to another provision of the bill that you know, you're intimately connected with. They're going to change the composition. They want to change the composition of the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, and you're a former commissioner. I know you joined, I think, 8 other former commissioners to sign a letter to Congress protesting that. Can you tell us about that provision? What would it do? And also tell us what the FEC actually does.
Sure. the FEC was the independent federal agency set up to enforce our federal campaign finance laws. So anybody running for Congress or the president, they have to comply with the law, and it governs how they raise and spend money. And when the federal law was set up and the agency was set up, they very carefully set it up so that there were 6 commissioners that run the agency, evenly split between the 2 political parties, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. That's very important because the FEC is regulating in an area protected by the First Amendment, political speech and political activity. And because it takes 4 votes for the agency to engage in any action, it means there has to be bipartisan agreement that, for example, someone running for Congress has broken the law and therefore the agency should prosecute them. This bill would change the FEC to a 5-member commission. That means that if, for example, there's a Democratic president in the White House and he nominates and is able to get people into 3 of the 5 seats, one party can dominate the FEC and all its decision-making, which means it can engage in partisan enforcement of the law. So, for example, if 3 of the commissioners are Democrats, they could decide to prosecute a Republican running for office because he has violated the law. And at the very same time, they could decide they won't prosecute a Democratic candidate who is engaged in exactly the same violation of the law. I can't think of anything more dangerous than a federal agency that engages in partisan law enforcement.
And so speaking of party finance, or there's also changes in rules around conflict of interest for the president and the vice president. Seems like maybe it's targeted at President Trump, or they might have liked this to have existed then. Right. Can you explain those provisions?
Yeah, there are certain provisions in there with regard to the president, for example, with regard to his financial holdings and other things. The problem with any of these kinds of provisions is that they are unconstitutional. You know, the Constitution lays out what the qualifications are to be president. Congress can't impose more provisions, and they certainly can't punish a president for somehow not complying with congressional mandates. So, again, that's just one of the many provisions in this bill that are unconstitutional and has Congress stepping outside of its authorized role.
And are you expecting constitutional challenges, or are you expecting to be involved in any constitutional challenges?
Oh, I expect there will be constitutional challenges, but even there, the sponsors of the bill have done something I've never seen before. They have said that anyone challenging this bill, if it becomes law, they can only file suit in one federal court across the entire country, and it's the federal court in the District of Columbia. I mean, you might wonder, well, why are they doing it there? Well, that's because, remember, when Harry Reid controlled the Senate, they added 3 seats to the Court of Appeals for the federal district in the District of Columbia, even though it was one of the most underworked appeals courts in the entire country. Why did they do that? So they could pack the court with 3 liberal justices, nominated by Barack Obama, so they could control decisions coming out of that court. This is basically another way of denying fundamental due process to anyone who wants to challenge this bill.
Well, and it also says, doesn't it, has to be in one filing with one attorney? Is that any challenge to the entire 800-page bill?
Yes, it says that a judge, if a case is filed, a judge can order all of the challengers to be represented by one lawyer and to file joint papers or pleadings. That means if all 50 states were to sue over this law, the court could say, well, there's only going to be one lawyer appearing before me to argue your case, which, again, is just such a violation of fundamental due process. I can't believe they would put this into a bill.
So we have to wrap up, but I just want to ask you, do you think this is going to pass?
Republicans, I think, have made a promise that they are going to stick together and they're going to filibuster the bill. So I think they can stop it unless Chuck Schumer violates the rules that govern the Senate to end the filibuster, which I think is one of the only ways they can do that.
Very interesting. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate your insights. Bye-bye. So keep in mind, we just touched on some of the changes this bill would bring about, but there's actually a lot more in it that stakeholders are now digging into. One big category is how it would limit free speech, which is the specialty of our next guest. So joining us now is David Keating. He's the president of the Institute for Free Speech. David, thank you for coming, because this is a very complicated bill which deals largely with election reform, but a lot more than that. And I know you would argue that it significantly limits free speech. Can you explain how? Because frankly, this bill is so dense, and I would venture to say that it's probably not designed to be understood by the masses. So can you break that down for us?
Yeah, it's about half the bill consists of restrictions on free speech in one form or another. It's very, very complicated, but I'll try to sum it up. And I guess the best way to sum it up is the bill would give subsidies for people who run for the House of Representatives, up to $7 million per candidate. So that means coming out of the federal treasury, we're going to be giving millions of dollars in subsidies to incumbents and presumably challengers. So they're getting subsidized. The rest of us are going to basically look through, I think, the most complicated law ever passed, if it becomes law, the most complex bill ever passed into law, that you would need a lawyer, not just any lawyer, a really good campaign finance lawyer to explain to you how to even try to obey it. So basically subsidies for politicians and restrictions for the rest of us.
So explain that a little bit. What kind of restrictions? If I was a citizen or an organization and wanted to do what would I have to do?
Sure. Well, you know, that's the most shocking part of this bill. The Supreme Court has said that, and I don't agree with the decision here, but the Supreme Court has said that Congress can regulate speech in election campaigns. So speech about candidates, by parties, and contribution limits, and so on and so forth. But the court has never said it's okay for Congress to regulate speech outside the election context. And that's what this bill does. So it has new provisions regulating speech about a judicial nominee sent to the US Senate. It has new provisions saying if an organization puts out communications about a bill before Congress, and those communications mention the name of a member of Congress, then they become regulated. And this is all brand new, and it's not only regulated, it would require donor exposure. So if you run a communication about a bill before Congress and you mention a member of Congress in your communication, then you're going to have to expose your donors to a public filing. And I think as a result, a lot of people will say, well, I don't want to join that group if my name's going to become associated with this cause. It may not be a popular cause. And as a result, we'll get less speech, less accountability on the Congress, and less information to the public.
That just seems so incredibly far-reaching and transformative. Under what's the justification for that?
Well, the proponents talk about transparency. And, you know, I understand the need for transparency, but really what we need is transparency for the government, transparency for the members of Congress, perhaps. But privacy is for the people. And we should be able to organize ourselves. We have a right under the First Amendment. It says the right to peacefully assemble, right? And when you join a group, to me, that's peaceably assembling to press a cause with the public and indeed with the National Congress or your local state governments. So we have a right to do that, and I think that's why this bill is so wrongheaded. The ACLU has joined us in criticizing these provisions of the bill. They said this would be a threat to our democracy.
So you talk about disclosure. They have to disclose their donors. In what way does that, in what form does that take?
Well, actually, this is pretty interesting, although it's outrageous at the same time. It would require donor exposure, but it would also require misinformation to be published. So in two different ways. First of all, it would require reporting, public reporting to the government of these donors. And some of the donors may have said, look, I want my money to be given for this other program here that the organization is doing. The bill doesn't care about that. It doesn't care about whether the donor is given for the communication or earmarked their contribution for something else. It would be associated with that contribution. So not only is it requiring donor exposure, it's requiring misinformation to be published to the public. I don't see any justification for that. The second thing is it would do the exact same thing. Many of the communications that would be regulated would require it to list the top donors in the communication. And again, in some cases, it would require donors who didn't give to the ad, may not know about the ad or support the ad in any way, to be listed in the ad itself, which I think is another form of government-required disinformation.
Wow. So I can see a couple of impacts potentially. I'm wondering what you're seeing. I can see, just opening the door to mass cancel culture, outing companies that are, donors that are supporting things. I can also see people not wanting to donate. What do you think the impacts of all this will be?
I think that's exactly what would happen. There's another alternative, which is the organizations publishing the communications to the public could self-censor the communications to take out the member of Congress's name in the communication. But why do we want to encourage groups to do that? When there's a bill up before Congress and you want to tell people, call your Congress, your member of Congress, well, a lot of people don't know who their member of Congress is. So I think it's really helpful in the communication itself to say, call, Congressman or Representative such and such or Senator, whatever the senators are from that state, and put that in the ad itself. But I think if the choice is between exposing their donors and requiring misinformation to be filed, a lot of organizations will self-censor their ads, and as a result, the ads will be less effective.
Wow. So obviously, your organization is opposed to these provisions. There's others joining you. What are the plans?
Well, this is another remarkable thing. This bill raced through the House of Representatives. They only had one hearing on it, and the hearing didn't address any of the free speech concerns in the bill. Basically half the bill went without any review by any congressional committee at all. And I think basically the problem right now is very few people have actually looked at the bill. I've talked to a number of political scientists. They're totally unaware of some of the provisions in this bill. And I'm talking about some of the leading political scientists in the country. And I think the same is true for many organizations in Washington, especially on the left. A lot outside of the ACLU, I think most liberal organizations simply haven't looked at the bill. And I think when they look at it, learn about it, and understand the impact, I think a number of them are going to be totally appalled. And my hope is that over time, opposition will build to this bill as more information gets out about it.
How much time do you think there is? What's the trajectory of this bill?
I have no idea. A lot of people don't think it's possible to pass this bill in this Congress because of the filibuster in the Senate. But the Senate can change the rules of the Senate at any time. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires a filibuster. So, the Democratic leadership is holding their strategy very close to the vest. They're certainly not telling me what they're planning on doing. And so I think they care about this a lot. I think they want to pass it. Whether it will pass, I don't know. But I don't think it's going to go through the Senate, extremely quickly. But I do think they would like to bring it up next month.
So how about media? How would this affect media? Those are communications we've been talking about. I guess that's like newsletters or email communications, advertisements. What about media?
Well, the media is actually totally exempt from all the campaign finance laws. So, I think that's a good thing. I actually think the rest of us should be exempt from them too, because we should be able to publish as well. But I do think if this becomes law, we'll see an accelerating trend of rich people buying media outlets. Jeff Bezos already bought the Washington Post a few years back, and I think you'd see an acceleration of that trend. I think you would see a lot of organizations try to publish more regularly so they could perhaps avoid the worst impacts of this bill. Because we have to keep in mind, the Supreme Court has said one thing very clearly, which is that the right to a free press, that's not the institutional press. That's not the corporate media. That is everyone. Everyone has the right to publish, and that includes organizations. So I think you would see organizations looking at the media exemption and saying to themselves, well, how can we make this work for us?
It almost sounds like they're begging Donald Trump to start a media.
I don't know. That would certainly be a strange result. But I think the bill has many potential unintended consequences if it were to become law. Another one, just off the top of my head, is I think it would really put a dent in the political parties, and it would encourage more political polarization. And we're already seeing, I mean, that's a rapid trend already. But the bill's subsidies of candidates, but not parties, I think would lead to even more polarization and more extreme candidates running, and many winning.
So it seems like a lot of the provisions in here would be open to constitutional challenges. It feels like we're very much in uncharted waters here. What do you think will happen along those lines? I assume is your organization planning to bring up any constitutional challenges?
Well, we've actually already talked about that. I mean, there are many targets in this bill to bring constitutional challenges on. But look, I think it's still way too early to plan those because clearly the bill hasn't been drafted very well. We were going over a particular provision this morning, and we found out that a provision left in the bill was something left over from some previous bill. And since they made H.R.1 by slapping together basically a kitchen sink approach of other bills, they forgot to take out a provision. So we're wondering what it meant. So the bill's not terribly well written. It's kind of hard to really prepare a challenge on something that probably will look significantly different in the end if it becomes law.
All right. Well, David, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we'll be hearing more from the Institute for Free Speech, and hope to have you back to give us updates.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Coming up after the break, we speak to the lawyer for the family of Ashli Babbitt, the Air Force veteran who was shot and killed in the Capitol on January 6th. But first, here's America Q&A. This week, we find out what people across the country think Americans can actually agree on.
That's tough. It doesn't seem like most Americans can agree. It seems like there's a polarization right now. Good night. I don't know. People disagree on health care, the virus. They disagree on economics. They disagree on politics. So it's tough.
I don't know really, because it didn't seem like very much.
We'd rather have President Trump back in office. That's what everybody agrees on.
We need help. Help in any way possible. We're looking for help, and we're looking for the people that we expect to help us that we voted in.
There needs to be more unity.
I feel like the basic things that we all agree on is probably a big one is like the importance of freedoms and democracy, like we were founded on.
This is the wealthiest country in the world.
That everyone deserves to feel safe and loved and happy, no matter who they are.
One nation and operate as an entire community instead of separate entities.
Equality.
I mean, I feel like the basic necessities thing, I mean, who could really argue with that? As an immigrant, if you can't live in America like a normal human being, then the way that we've been taught, everything that we've heard about America isn't true. And I mean, I just don't want to live in that America.
That's a broad question. I don't know what Americans could agree on, honestly. I guess we could agree that, well, I hope we could agree that people living in poverty is something that shouldn't be in America, especially with all of the welfare here.
Really nothing the way America's on. You see how it's going right now. I don't think we could agree on anything.
We need to get Americans back to work again, for sure. Because if you don't, you're going to be living off of one stimulus after another.
When you look at TV networks in America, a soundbite and fight-it-out culture prevails on news and commentary programs. As a Canadian, I'm fascinated with America, and I wanted to offer American thought leaders an opportunity to share their thoughts in a deep dive format, where we can explore their ideas together. And so American Thought Leaders was born. The world's most brilliant thinkers believed that open discourse was the key to greatness. However, all around the world, we see that discourse is being stifled, and political agendas have subverted media. The Epoch Times launched its Global Thought Leaders program to bring back this great tradition of free thought. As the host of American Thought Leaders, every week I interview some of the most intriguing minds on the most pressing issues of our time. Be sure to check out our new episodes every week.
On January 6, Ashli Babbitt was part of the group that breached the Capitol building. She was 34, an avid Trump supporter, and an Air Force veteran. At 2:43 p.m., she was shot and killed by police. What's so surprising about this case is how little else we know about it, even 2 months later. This was an unarmed citizen involved in a fatal police shooting in the Capitol building. While we may get some more answers soon, Ashli's family is preparing to sue. We sat down a bit earlier with the lawyer for her family. We're joined now by Terry Roberts. He is the attorney for Ashli Babbitt's husband and family. Thank you for joining us. This is a pretty important case, and we haven't heard a whole lot about it. So I'm glad you're here to talk to us today. I just wanted to start by asking you, is there anything more that you could tell us about Ashli so we get to understand who she was as a person? I mean, we know she was 35, a 14-year Air Force vet, and from San Diego. What else can you tell us about her?
Well, I mean, I know that I've spoken to her husband and I've spoken to her mother, and I've learned a lot about her family background. She was, according to her mother, a real go-getter, and she wanted to go into the military at a young age. And she, as soon as she finished high school, she joined the Air Force, went into the Air Force, and served an 8-year hitch. And she, I know she received some 14 decorations and medals for her service in the United States Air Force. She received the Army Achievement Award, which is, a pretty high award. And one of the pictures is a picture of her in Afghanistan. She's standing right next to a 4-star general, John Abbasid, and she was recognized, or the term is coined, for her boosting morale at the base there. So, I mean, she served her country honorably, and then after her active duty, she went into the Air National Guard, stayed in the Washington area. She served in the Guard for about 6 years. And then she remarried and moved to San Diego, where she and her husband operated a pool cleaning business. And she was the administrative side, he was the work side. And she was very much committed patriot. I mean, she had strong feelings and support for Donald Trump and decided to come out and be here on January 6th. So that's pretty much what I know about her. I mean, I can also say that she went to, on January 6th, went to see the president give a speech, and she was with friends, and she then walked up towards the Capitol. I am not privy to how she got into the Capitol. We're looking for any help from anybody that can help us with any footage that might show that. I'll give you a Twitter site, or Ashli Tips is the Twitter name. And if anybody has any videos to contribute or any knowledge about Ashli, we would ask them to do so.
How many videos have you received? I know there's one main one that you've been looking at. How many different pieces of footage do you have?
I can't count them. I can't count them right now for you, but we've received several, and they've been very, very helpful. When you get them from sort of, I'll call it fresh, before they've, and rather than looking at them on YouTube, they're easier to handle and work with and analyze.
So are you aware right now, are there investigations going on into Ashli's death on the Capitol Police or government side?
Yes, there's a United States attorney who's conducting a criminal investigation. I'm not privy to anything that's going on with that. They don't keep me advised of that. And there is the Metropolitan Police Department, which is the police agency in the District of Columbia, was asked to do the internal affairs investigation. And I'm not privy to that as well. That's the only two investigations I know of.
Are you aware of the status of the officer right now? Is he working on paid leave? You're not?
I have no idea. I really don't. Truly.
Okay.
Yeah, normally, normally the police agency would issue a statement explaining the case, explaining what happened, and identifying the officer. Might indicate what his status is, if he's on administrative leave or whatever. Nothing like that's been issued by the U.S. Capitol Police.
So you've been working since, I believe, the late 70s in police misconduct cases. What do you make of the fact that that kind of information hasn't been revealed?
Well, I've actually been working, I'd say the mid-'80s would be when I started this. What do I make of it? I think it's unusual. I think if this is high-profile case, let's call it, and a lot of people have an interest in it, and we've heard nothing. And that's quite unusual, because if you look at what happened over the summer, the George Floyd case, that information regarding who the officers were and was released right away. And I think that's true in other cases as well. The Breonna Taylor case, things like that. There's the police agencies issued some version of the events and the identity of the officers. And we haven't had that at all in this case.
And it doesn't even seem like the public or media are crying out for it. That's one of the things that has surprised me about this case and why I wanted to speak with you today.
That seems to be the case.
So there is a lawyer for, even though we don't know the identity of the shooter, he does have a lawyer, Mark Schammel. He told Real Clear Investigations, I don't know if he's still the lawyer on the case. Are you aware if he is or not?
I'm not aware. I would assume he is.
He said it's a false narrative that he issued no verbal commands or warnings. He was screaming, stay back, don't come in here. And he also said that you probably wouldn't hear that on the videos because, you know, it was noisy. He's on the other side of the glass. So from all of the evidence that you've examined so far, the videos, maybe you've spoken to some witnesses, do you think it's possible that he was screaming a warning before shooting?
It's possible, but from Ashli's vantage point, there's no way she could have heard such a warning. He is concealing himself or hiding in a room. He's wearing a mask. If he was yelling a warning, you would think you would see some reaction by the officers who are down the hall. And I don't see any reaction in the videos that I've seen from those officers. In those pictures, I don't see anybody rushing up to assist. So, I mean, that would raise a question in my mind whether or not he was screaming at the door. But I can say this, if you've ever been to a major league ballpark and you're in the ninth inning and it's a close game and you're outside the ballpark trying to scream something and all the crowd is yelling, you're not going to hear. And I think the officer would know, he's got to know whether he's communicating with who he wants to communicate with or not. So the point is that he had time, if she got through that window, he would have time to confront her, step out, confront her, give verbal commands, give her a warning if he's going to shoot, a clear warning, lock eyes with her, and that would be what you would do if you were going to effectively provide a warning. None of that happened.
Right. So I want to ask you exactly about that. You're arguing that it was an unjustified use of deadly force, which violated her constitutional rights. So what would the scenario have to have looked like for the deadly force to be justified?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of principles. First major principle is the standard in law enforcement that you use only that force which is necessary to accomplish a lawful purpose. Second is that an officer can only use deadly force if he's confronted with an immediate threat on his life or someone else's life. A clear and present danger of death or serious bodily injury to the officer or someone else. That's the only time you can use deadly force. And there is nothing that I can see in this video footage that justifies the officer in using deadly force on Ashli Babbitt. I mean, she is 5 or 6 feet away. She's unarmed. She's not even through the window yet. And she's not an immediate threat to him or anybody else. And so under these standards, that the use of force was clearly not justified.
And I can see in the minutes before the shooting that there are officers on the same side of the door as Ashli Babbitt. Nobody seems, in alert mode or terribly concerned. Do you know what the situation was there at that point?
Well, all we can do is, I don't, because we haven't filed the lawsuit yet, haven't taken depositions to ask. Haven't seen an internal police investigation yet to ask. I hope those questions are being asked. But, an inference appears to be that the officers, there were 3 officers standing in front of the door. You see, those are 3 Capitol Police officers standing in front of the door. They end up moving to the side of that door and no longer defending the door. A tactical team arrives before the shooting, 20-some seconds before the shooting. A tactical team arrives, and they are right there talking to who we think is the Sergeant at Arms or a representative of the Sergeant at Arms. And so they're conferring with him, and I think it looks pretty reasonable to infer that they've decided to no longer defend the door. And I don't think it's for want of police officers, because these are tactical officers there. They've got, they're well armed, they've got helmets. They could defend that door if they wanted to. And so I think I think it's an inference that can be drawn that they've decided to abandon the door, which would leave the possibility that people will go through the door.
The shooter's lawyer also said that the officer was acting within his training. He said it should be a training video how he handled the situation. What he did was an unbelievable act of heroism.
I don't see it as an act of heroism. And I would say that if he's acting in accordance with his training, he's not properly trained. Because the training is just, the training of police officers is in accordance with the standards I mentioned earlier. And this lady is not an immediate threat. He's not trained to shoot somebody unless they're an immediate threat. And really the simple thing is here, as I said about the first principle, is you only use that amount of force which is necessary to accomplish your purpose. The purpose that if she got through the window and negotiated the barrier there, they had chairs and tables against that door. If she negotiated all that successfully, he had time to get out there, establish his presence, which is the first thing you do. Establish your presence, give her verbal commands, and And if he had grounds, arrest her with a pair of handcuffs. And that's the kind of force, all the force that he would need. And he had a number of police officers who were behind him, who could have easily assisted if he needed it. So, you know, when that kind of situation is, you can make a simple arrest. You don't kill the person to do that. I would not be here. I would not be here if bringing a claim on the basis of the fact that I believe she had a right to step through the window. I'm here because she had a right to keep her life, even though she stepped through that window.
Are you aware of any other officers that directly, pointed a loaded weapon at anyone else that day?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I cannot answer that with a definitive no. I've heard, I can't say, but I know one thing. I know that I think it was a rare occasion when an officer pulled a gun, but it could have happened that day. But it wasn't like they were all pulling guns all the time. And I know that nobody else was shot that day. And there were incidents in which the police and the protesters, which were much more dangerous than this, in which no deadly force was used.
Right. And do you know, just let me quickly ask you, do you know for certain what type of officer that was, if it was a Capitol officer or some other special agent of some kind?
Yeah, it was my understanding from the information which has been disclosed by, I'm not sure who, but anyway, the information is that it was a lieutenant, African-American lieutenant in Capitol Police.
Okay. And we have to wrap up, so let me just very quickly ask you, do you know yet who you will actually be suing?
Do I know? I have a good idea, yes. Yes, we haven't completed a lot of the investigation we need to do and take some other preliminary steps that have to be done before we can bring a suit.
Okay, and do you have a timeline?
We're working on it. No, can't give you time, Mom. Don't want to disappoint anybody.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it, and I hope you'll keep us updated on the case.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So the legal team has asked that anyone who has information or videos about Ashli's activities that day to please send it to them via the Twitter that you saw. That's @forashli, @FOR Ashli, or email forashlytips@aol.com. On March 8th, President Joe Biden marked International Women's Day by signing an executive order. It was to create a gender policy council within the White House. Our next guest, a veteran fighter for feminist causes, has a few problems with that council. Joining us now is Dr. Warren Farrell. He's the author of The Boy Crisis and a former member of the National Organization for Women in New York City. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to our talking.
So the White House Gender Policy Council has just been announced, and you're not very happy with this. You put out a video and a statement, and you argue that it's sexist and racist, and it violates Biden's campaign promise of unity. Can you break that down a little bit? I think especially the sexist part, considering it is a White House Council on Gender. Tell us about it.
Here we have a White House Gender Policy Council. Now, if you ask your son, 5 years old or more, are there boys? Their son or daughter will say yes. Are there girls? Yes. Are there boys and girls, or just boys or just girls? Your son, 5 years old or older, a daughter will 5 years old or older will say they're boys and they're girls. But apparently Biden doesn't understand that. So your children know more than the president. He feels that gender doesn't include boys and doesn't include men. So left boys' issues, men's issues, and fathers' issues out of the White House Gender Policy Council, which is just clearly sexist. It's racist because the people in the United States who are having the greatest amount of problems, the ones who are the great disproportionate number of prisoners, the street homeless, are blacks. And if when it comes to males versus females among blacks, black males are 25 times more likely to be shot and killed by police as black females are. They're much more likely, when we hear driving while black, that profiling should be called DWBM, driving while black male. And so any male who is black is left out of the Gender Policy Council, yet one of the supposed missions of the Gender Policy Council is racial justice. On almost every metric, black females are doing significantly better than black males. Psychological metrics, mental health metrics, employment metrics, how much they earn, and how minimally likely they are to be in prison compared to males, minimally likely to be homeless, and so on. And so he's not getting that. President Biden claims to be in favor of LGBTQ communities, and yet, if you're an LGBTQ male, you are not included in the Gender Policy Council. So this is sexism that enhances racism, and sexism that enhances all his outreach to minority communities that he's supposedly in favor of. And so here, the President Biden that I saw during the campaign was promising unity, and he's increasing the division between the sexes, promising healing. This certainly doesn't heal people to not be heard, not to be seen, not to be cared for, not to have their issues recognized. He promised diversity. This is eliminating all diversity that includes males, including all the types of diversity I just mentioned. It's not inclusive, and it's not really in favor of equity at all.
So what's your understanding of what this council will actually do? The co-chair, Jennifer Klein, said,
"The executive order requires the council to submit to the president a government-wide strategy for advancing gender equity and equality in the United States."
What this council will be doing is going to every single, the top layers of every single part of the government and saying, what is there in your department, like let's say the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, and saying, okay, under President Trump, if your son is accused of sexual harassment, the Trump administration said he should have due process. Before that, the Obama administration said that no, that due process should be very minimal because we should believe women if they claim that there's sexual harassment. And so each department of government will be figuring out things like this that they can do to basically expand the rights of women and diminish the rights of men. And I say this as somebody who had been 3 years on the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City. But my belief is that there should have been not a women's movement blaming men and not a men's movement blaming women, but there should be a gender liberation movement freeing both sexes from the rigid roles of the past and creating more flexible roles for both our sons and our daughters. Ironically, that's also what Betty Friedan, who wrote the Feminine Mystique, but also The Second Stage, who said in The Second Stage that there's a need for a second stage of the women's movement, which is to focus on the issues that boys and men were having, because women would never be free to be, let's say, conquer glass ceilings if they were torn between working in industry and trying to take care of their children at home, unless they learned to feel okay about marrying men who were interested in taking care of their children if they were that type of woman who wanted to focus on their career.
You're saying the administration is, seeing women in isolation from men, from the rest of the society, and thinking that just by focusing on that, you can fix something, but your argument is basically you can't do that.
You're exactly right. So, for example, boys are doing worse in every academic subject than girls are. They're dropping out of high school much more frequently than girls are. And therefore, when you drop out of high school and you're a boy, your unemployment rate, even before COVID, was more likely to be in the 20+ percentile when you're in your 20s. Boys are 66% more likely to be living in their parents' basement. Now, I don't know any of my daughters nor any woman that I know who's interested in an unemployed male standing in who lives in his family's basement and has no motivation, as a possible future father. And so if we don't pay attention to boys, we're not paying attention to girls. We want boys who are worthy of our daughter's love. We're all in the same family boat. The Biden administration approach of focusing on one sex winning creates both sexes losing.
What do you see as being the impact on, young men who are growing up today? Say that might be different from if they were a young man in the 60s or 50s.
Yes. First of all, they're much more likely to experience problems in more than 50 different developmental areas. And so when I started researching the boy crisis, I presented to my publisher originally 10 causes of the boy crisis. And I found that I was really wrong, that there are 10 causes, but one cause, the lack of father involvement, was impacting boys much more than any other cause. And so we have two major problems here. One is that after divorce, very frequently children lose contact with their dads. Those dad-deprived children, I found, are the ones that are much more likely to commit suicide, much more likely to be addicted to video games, much more likely to take alcohol, drugs, be addicted to porn, be likely to fail in every single academic subject, especially reading and writing, that are the two biggest predictors of success. And so these are just some of the impact of the lack of father involvement. The other group that is very vulnerable are women who are having children without being married. My research found that in those cases, the children's involvement with their father was likely to be an average of 3.5 years. So the children begin to get some attachment to the father, but then the father, from their perspective, appears to abandon them, and especially boys. And if those boys go from a minimal amount of father involvement or a fatherless involvement to a school system which has minimal amount of male role models that are constructive, I found that they were especially vulnerable to a number of things. Gangs, joining gangs as a sense of family, dealing drugs to get money quickly, being much more likely to become an ISIS recruit, being much more likely to be a mass shooter, being much more likely to commit crimes.
Wow, so it sounds like most of the social ills that we would like to solve, it's all coming down to this one issue in your mind. Is that right?
Yeah, well, yes, it really wasn't in my mind at the beginning of the research. I started, at the beginning of the research, I said things like we need to have male teachers in schools as well as female teachers, so boys have male role models. And what the single most important thing about father involvement was, I found, was the greater propensity on the part of dads to enforce boundaries. Both mothers and fathers set boundaries very similarly. They both said you can't have your ice cream until you finish your peas. And the kids tested boundaries very similarly. They both tried to have as few peas as possible before they got their ice cream. But the differences between moms and dads would usually, if something happened that was negative in school, the moms didn't want to get into a big fight with the kids about, how many peas they should have. So they would back off. And then the children started to learn that they could manipulate their mom by sort of appealing to certain empathies and not have to have so many peas before they got their ice cream. So they learned to be coercive and manipulative to a greater degree and to not have as much attention focused on what they needed to do. So whereas with the father was more likely to say, excuse me, I know you had a tough day in school, but we have a deal here. And the deal here is that you can't have your ice cream until you finish your peas. Oh, Dad, you're you're so mean. Mom's not like that. This is Dad, not Mom. If you don't finish your peas, you don't get your ice cream. And if you keep whining and complaining, you won't have any ice cream tomorrow night either. Oh boy, I've got to focus on now finishing my peas. So that's an example of the ingredient, the primary ingredient for postponed gratification. And the postponed gratification, as most of us know, is the single most important predictor of success or failure.
Very interesting. So we've got to wrap up, but let me just ask you, you said you were talking to Jen Klein. Are you still trying to engage with them?
The responses that I've gotten from Jen Klein have been very, oh, we're taking care of boys and men. Oh, we care about boys and men, with absolutely no evidence of that. And so we've had a frustrating communication. Focusing on women as victims does not do good for women. People don't respect victims, and they become fearful of victims. And so I feel that the feminist approach to this is really undermining women in the long run.
It's very interesting, since you came from a feminist background. It seems we need to take more of a whole of society approach rather than a whole of government approach on gender equity.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. It's just a delight to talk with you.
That's all for today's show. Thank you so much for watching The Nation Speaks. Join us every Saturday, 11 a.m. to noon Eastern. And from all of us here, have a great week.
Don't let YouTube decide what information you get. That's your choice. YouTube is deleting our videos and cuts you off from a source of honest reporting. Make sure you don't lose access to NTD's news content, and take a quick moment to subscribe to our newsletter so no matter what happens here, you'll keep your access to a trustworthy news source.